So, official welcome to all of you who've come tonight to hear Mark, Porter and Andii Bowsher in conversation together about music and liturgy and connections with God's creation. And I'm going to start by just handing over to Andii, please, for an opening prayer. Thank you, Andii.
Okay, I tend to do opening prayers not as a set piece, but an invitation to commune, as it were. So I invite you to, if you're able, to just kind of sit comfortably. If you prefer to close your eyes, please do, but otherwise don't worry. And I invite you to take a nice, long, slow, deep breath. And we might remember as we do so that image from the first verses of the Bible, first chapters of the Bible, of God breathing into the earthling the breath of life. And perhaps the image towards the end of at least one of the Gospels of Jesus breathing on his disciples and saying, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Let's breathe in as we remember those scenes. And I invite you as well just to open your eyes if they're closed and have a look at the faces and names that you can see on your screen. Scroll through them if necessary, depends on the size of your screen. Recognizing each person here as someone whom God loves and who God might use to say something to us each personally. So, God bless you all, and all of us may be blessed as we think and speak together. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Andii. Right, well, I'm really looking forward to this workshop because we've got two people really well qualified to talk to us this evening. Mark has published numerous books and articles on Christian music and worship, and he's going to be telling us a bit about his most recent publication, For the Warming of the Earth, which came out earlier this year. And Andii has taught theological students about leading worship, written many a liturgy, including quite a few for us at Green Christian, with climate and environmental issues in mind. So he at the moment is working as a university chaplain and very part-time practical theology lecturer. So I'm going to hand over to Andii and Mark now and let the conversation begin.
Thank you, Barbara. And yes, it will be a conversation. So I hope it won't end up being too much of you watching me and Mark talking to one another, but because we have built-in possibilities for interaction and so on. But yes, a large part of it, it's a structured conversation that we're going to be having. And we hope that by doing that, it will bring out various things. But please do use the chat. And if we spot a question or a comment and so on, we'll do our best to kind of weave it in. But there'll be other opportunities as well to do that, which will be signaled during the course of the time together. So Barbara said a bit about myself and Mark, and other things may come out as we talk. But we want to begin, and it's in a sense, I'm posing this question to you, Mark, as we agreed, about how we understand words like worship and liturgy, and what we expect of worship and liturgy and what they do. So, just wondering what's your response to that? What do you think about worship and liturgy? What's this endeavor?
Yeah. And it's such a fascinating question. I think when I read about worship and liturgy, there's a tendency, I think, for a lot of theologians to try and define liturgy quite closely. So you always come across this idea, liturgy is the work of the people or something like that. And they, in some ways, that's a lovely starting point. I'm not sure it's the one I find most helpful. Um, I come from a background moving between a lot of different traditions, where they all operate in very different ways. And I, one of the things that came up in our preparation conversation was actually sometimes it's not so helpful to think about what worship or liturgy is, but often it's more helpful to think perhaps about what it might do and what we're aiming for it to do. And so I was thinking across different traditions and the different kinds of things it does in different settings. I made a little list. Sometimes we sort of think it should take us on a journey. It might be something where we expect an encounter with the Spirit. Um, Perhaps in more charismatic traditions, it might be about expressing or managing emotions. We can be more theological. We can say it's about directing things back to God. We have public liturgies as well, right? And they're not all enclosed in church buildings. So sometimes liturgy is there to act as a witness to others. We've got these ideas of liturgy as something that perhaps shapes and sums up the rest of our life or world, that draws us together as community, that gives space for introspection, or 100 other things. We've got a lot of different bouncing off points here, and there's a lot of different logics and priorities going on in different places.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's it's important to notice that, because often when we inhabit, I think, a particular church tradition, Sunday by Sunday and sometimes more frequently, we tend to unconsciously, quite often, or subconsciously, certainly, to imbibe a sort of set of almost a set of tram lines about, so this is what we do, this is what we do, this is what we do, and that can be restrictive when we want to move out of those tram lines, as it were, beyond that, and be producing something that heads in a different direction, or is trying to do something else from what we normally do. And that kind of mental self-restriction can be one of the biggest problems we have. And I think it can be helped to address, and this might go to the leading worship things. We used to encourage students, when I was doing a module on this, to actually begin to plan with an explicit kind of question about, so what is it that we are trying to achieve in this worship? And I mean, there are obvious answers to that bit of the question, like we're trying to worship God, and that's fine. But at a human level, what kinds of things do we envisage as outcomes to this? Are we expecting people to be taught? Possibly not. Are we expecting people to pray? What would be the focus of, or foci of that? So actually being quite intentional about what you're trying to achieve, and sometimes that can help us to move out of those tram lines, I think, that we can get into.
Yeah, and I mean this question of change, it feels a slightly artificial point to bring it in, but a lot of my recent work has been on sort of music and how communities are changing the music they do in response to ecological crisis, right? And so the question I was sort of thinking about is, okay, we have a set of things that liturgy and worship does, but then you say, okay, worship and liturgy is about God. What does that mean about in the midst of ecological crisis? Do we want to have it still obeying the same fundamental logic? These are our set of tasks, and we'll try and wedge a bit of green stuff in there somewhere. Or do we actually need the liturgy and worship to accomplish something different in our current situation? Do we need it to do something different when we're thinking beyond the human realm? Do we want green issues to be there as a secondary concern, or can they actually become part of the primary sort of metaphor through which the worship's happening?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
what other purposes do we want to have? Sorry, do we want it to change people? Do we believe it can change people? Do we want it to nurture different sets of relationships? All these kinds of questions. The changing ecological situation sort of unsettles some of those sort of ideas I think we had in our heads beforehand.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I was thinking that the issue about weaving in, if that's the right metaphor, there might be others. The kind of green environmental dimension is actually, it's a work in progress as well. So, I mean, I would say to anybody here who's thinking about how can we do worship together that is more environmentally aware. That actually there isn't an answer yet. We're actually composing that answer as we attempt to do that, and we share ideas together, and we talk to one another about what we've done and so on. We're actually pushing out the boundaries of what could be done, and we're also, I think, recalibrating our own thinking, as it were, as we do that, and we begin to make connections implicitly and explicitly between uh, bits of inherited Christian theology and the kind of Christian theologies that we're wanting to do, where we're much more cognizant of the ecological dimensions. So we're all on a learning journey as we do this, and the composing and going, and being part of liturgies is part of that education process. I mean, I would say one of the sub things that liturgy and worship is always doing is, well, we're always learning from it, and we're always learning with it. So that's always going to be a part of it. We're going to learn good things. We're going to learn things, negatively as well from that. But to give ourselves permission to experiment, to give it a go, to make connections, to talk to one another about it, to share, I think is a really important part of it. I noticed that there's something gone into the chat about that. So, yeah, carry on.
I was just going to say, if your sort of guiding metaphor there is learning, I think one of my sort of key things is often relationships. What kinds of relationships are we establishing within that worship and liturgy and music? What sets of interactions with different people, different spaces, different entities, and I think that tends to be the theme I always come back to.
Yeah. And that could be the thing, that if you're too trite and sort of say, oh, well, liturgy is all about worshipping God, it can lead you to kind of forget that actually there's a whole web of relationships, if you're involved in corporate worship, that are involved as well. And they have to be managed in a sense, or you have to be aware of those. Yeah, I noticed Catherine's question about something about creation restored. That actually the Orthodox would be very keen on that. The idea that liturgy is a foretaste of heaven, and I think that's definitely worth bearing in mind as a dimension of the way that we inform ourselves about when we're putting together worship, when we're composing a liturgy or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that's there. I think it's not something that's always there, right? I think some liturgy pushes us more in that direction than others.
Yeah. Yeah.
And certainly when I've been doing work on music and ecology, I've been very conscious that some groups are very conscious of the future dimension of what they're doing, and some really want to resist that. They want to say, okay, actually these long time scales, they haven't always been helpful to us in addressing some of the things that we want to think about now. We want to focus on the present, on this being here and now, and perhaps if some of that idea of restoration of creation is already in the back of our minds, then we sort of push away from that. So I think, yeah.
And I think there's something in there as well about recognizing who's in the room or the space with us. What are the needs of the people present, and what are the ways that they will understand things, and where is there a bit of a journey that they're going on from where? Do you understand that? Do we understand that? Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. To where are we going with them? I'm keeping an eye on the time as well here, so I'm kind of thinking we ought to do the next thing in our staged conversation.
Oh.
So I hope that was what we've just said has been kind of given a bit of a flavour and so on. I don't think we've defined worship and liturgy, but perhaps accept implicitly by the way that we've used those words as we've talked, I hope. What Mark and I fancy doing at this point is to have a brief poll of all those who are here with us now. And we invite you to use the chat. So if you haven't already got the chat bit up on your screen, now's your time to do that. In my case, it's the buttons at the bottom saying more that need to be got out to reveal the chat bit. There may be other devices that do it differently. Anyway, so what we'd like to do for a couple of minutes now, just or so, is to ask you to reflect on a question that we're going to put to you and put brief answers in the chat. Probably isn't room to have an essay, but a sentence or two would be great. And then everyone can have a look at what everyone else puts up. You can, of course, opt out and not opt to not to do it. I hope you won't. So what kinds of occasions come to mind with phrases like green worship or environmental liturgy? I'll say that again. What kinds of occasions come to mind with phrases like green worship or environmental liturgy? There may be other phrases that come to mind in that sort of realm as well.
I don't know if we should comment this as it sort of comes in or whether we should wait till the end. It's interesting already how many times harvest is being mentioned. Season of creation, prayers in the environment, forest church, outdoor worship. Sorry?
Yeah, outdoor and being outside. Forest church has got a mention there.
Climate conferences, lament, Easter. I wasn't expecting Easter.
Well, that sounds like that could deserve a little bit more. I mean, what that suggests to me, the Easter one, and I don't know whether I'm right, but there are a number of bits of Easter liturgy that can take place outdoors, such as going up on a hill at sunrise, that kind of thing, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, things happening outside. Lots of mentioning different things outside.
So I'm getting an impression here of there are things to do with occasions at church, either seasonal or particular occasions where there's a theme that relates to that, and things like prayers for the environment, harvest festival, and so on, that counts for, but also experiences of worshipping outside in various ways. Kind of an interesting one as well. I can't find it now, about walking. Oh, worship walk. And I think there may have been another one mentioned walking, where the sense of moving around is part of it as well. I'm kind of thinking that's kind of interesting, because a big part of some church liturgies in the past, less so nowadays, it seems to me, were processions, for example. So there's a kind of formalized walking, and then there's perhaps a more informal walking.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that a lot of these are very clearly defined things, and also quite exceptional things some of the time. A lot of these are things that we don't experience every week. They're things that are for particular times of the year or particular unusual sort of ways of doing worship.
Yeah, I did notice someone had put sort of every day or something like that. Something that gave the impression it should be something that's more normally a part of the way we worship, and not an added extra or a special time or something like that. Which I actually, that's one of the things that I'm really keen on. And some people may know I've produced a daily office of prayers for daily use, where actually the idea is to have environmental concern woven in, but not the only thing that you pray about, but it's definitely in every liturgy, as it were. Every prayer has something that relates us back to the wider environment, either as crisis or as something to be enjoyed, or in other ways as well.
Well, I think also in my work on music, you sort of very quickly realize the ideas of creation and nature and plants and animals and natural phenomena, they're omnipresent in a lot of our worship. The question is, are they present in the way we want them to be or need them to be? It's not that there aren't implicit relationships with creation already present. It's the question of whether they're the right and most helpful ones for the present moment.
Yeah, yeah. Right. I want to say thank you to everyone who's put thoughts in there. In a sense, there's almost too much for us to digest at the moment, but they remain there, and I guess we might well be able to make them available to everyone afterwards, so that you can look back on them and mull over some of the particularly captivating ones for you later. Yeah, they're really great. Thank you, and it reassures myself and Mark, I think, that the kind of conversations we are having beforehand are not so disconnected from what people are expecting, in a sense, in terms of scope of what we talk about. We wanted to move on, though, at this point. I wanted to ask Mark, because Mark, as we heard earlier, has produced this book very recently. It's been published. And so I was wondering, Mark, whether you felt able to tell us in a few minutes, really, about what your research and indeed what you've written in the book tells us about green corporate worship, if I can put it that way. If you can kind of give us the headlines, really. And that's Mark's task. The task for everyone else here is, as Mark talks, if there are particular things that you want to return to or pick up, please put that into the chat. And again, we'll do our best to try and pick that up. We've probably got about 20 minutes or so on this part of the discussion, really, where hopefully it's wider, but Mark will be kind of giving us some grist for the mill, as it were, hopefully.
Yeah. So I suppose I need a little bit of context to sort of explain what the whole thing is about before I get onto specific lessons. And the book sort of arose out of something I was noticing back around 2019, which was that a lot of Christian groups were suddenly getting interested in the environment in a way they hadn't been before, in the wake of various protests and things. And an awful lot of them seemed to be doing something with music as part of their different events they were putting on. And I didn't have much of an idea why they would be using music or what they would be expecting that music to do or how they would be thinking about it. And so I started exploring what they were doing, how they were beginning to develop new practices, and why they were doing what they were doing. And the book sort of concentrates on 5 also different categories. I think some of them you'll be very familiar with already. There's the first chapter is looking at climate albums and worship songs. So looking at the Resound Worship Doxicology album and also climate vigil songs from the Porter's Gate in the States. And a lot of that chapter is sort of looking at the challenges for them in incorporating environmental themes into the worship song genre. And that comes back to the question we had at the start about what you expect worship and things to do. Because worship songs have this logic where they're all about bringing your heart in praise to God and sort of moving to that moment where you can authentically express that sense of worship. So if that's what they're about, if that's what they're trying to do, how does the environment find a way into that? And I mean, it was discovering, okay, they have 100 different ways of doing that. They don't find one way. For evangelicals, a lot of it's about using scripture to do that, about taking people on different emotional journeys. But often also hitting against this limit that there's certain things you can do here, but there's only so far you can go. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to incorporate the environment there in this attempt to nudge people one step closer to caring about it. So evangelicals are not renowned for caring about the environment. It's not what they're famous for. And so the idea is, okay, if we can incorporate this theme a little bit into the kinds of things they do, maybe it'll nudge a couple of people closer to where they need to be.
So if I can just come in on that, Mark, then for those others of us who are thinking about composing liturgies and possibly involving music in that, part of the thing is knowing your the people who are going to be praying with you, in a sense that so you can calibrate how you introduce these kind of environmental themes or bring them in to what you already understand of, their starting point in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, and there was part of that I found incredibly frustrating because they can't sort of they can't produce this version of ideal environmental green worship within that framework. They can't go all the way that you would maybe
Yeah,
want them to. But still that nudging is really important. And I sort of came
yeah.
out of that part of it with a sort of respect for the pragmatism of as to what they're doing there.
My suspicion is that a lot of people here might be in churches where that kind of pragmatism and softly kind of thing is going to be really important in terms of the way they'd approach it.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a situation lots of people do find themselves in. Um, there's a bit of stuff in there about emotions, right? Which emotions can you express in worship? There were some
Yes.
of them sort of writing very angry songs, and then I had one person who was saying she was writing all these angry songs, and then she was throwing them in the bin because no one would ever sing them, and they wouldn't be helpful. And that was really interesting, thinking about the emotional landscapes that are permitted in our worship, and how we manage those. I think.
Yeah.
Lament's already come up as one thing in the chat. I think anger is another, but also what kind of pressures are there to feel joyful emotions or sorrow and things at different parts of our liturgies. There's patterns that we sort of sink into.
Yeah. I'm just
Um,
looking at a chat thing here, and there's one about can worship include protest? I think there was something in the book where you touched on that. Is it worth
well, if I
bringing that
keep
in now?
moving, if I
Yes.
keep moving through, the next chapter is the protest one.
Yeah.
Um, So my next chapter was sort of looking at Christian climate action and some of the ways that they've used music and different people there have incorporated music into protest actions, um, alongside broader liturgies a lot of the time. And it was really interesting sort of seeing the different tasks they give music and liturgy there. Some of it where there's a tense protest situation is about managing their own emotions. Again, we don't want to become angry. We don't want to sort of really upset the people around us. We're going to try and keep calm. We're going to use music for that. Or there's other uses. We're going to sort of try and do something surprising. We're going to take the lyrics of Amazing Grace and we're going to rewrite them to be about well, there's one example where a couple of protesters were at the Shell AGM and they sort of rewrote Amazing Grace to have some lyrics about Shell and what they hope for Shell's sort of ultimate demise. And that sense of doing something maybe slightly humorous, something unexpected, something subversive with them, something that will catch people's attention, but also something that's deeply spiritual at the same time, where you're bringing all that stuff and you're bringing it in prayer, you're bringing it to God, and you're using music as a vehicle, perhaps, for the Spirit to be present amongst you.
The
There's
interesting thing, of course, there is that there are people who aren't worshipping present with you as well. So there's an element of how is this act of worship going to also be received or perceived, or kind of how is that going to affect those who don't share it as an act of worship, but are maybe feeling it as a threat or maybe bemused or whatever it would be.
Yeah, and that element of encounter is the really important one in protest, right? How are you encountering other people? Are you bringing them something they're going to resonate with, something that will surprise them, something that will upset them? And there's an element of that that's uncontrollable, right? There's going to be a diversity of people there that are going to react in different ways. And you're pointing in a particular, you're hoping to point in a particular direction, but you're not going to be able to control everyone's reactions. I think there was one songwriter, she was talking about how it felt authentic to bring worship out into this street space outside the body of the church. It felt like it's real, it's what it's supposed to do. I'm not sure everyone that passed by her singing would have thought the same thing, but I think some of them would have. And yeah.
So we can see protest as an act of worship, and protest making use of the kind of materials that people usually associate with corporate worship as well.
And I think the other key element here is that in these outdoor in these street spaces, there's a lot of people that are familiar with certain aspects of Christian liturgy and Christian song. And I think doing something with that familiarity is often key to how people strategize those kinds of spaces and how they make them meaningful for both the protesters and the people passing by.
Yeah. And I guess there's practicalities involved in that as well. Like, how do you make sure that people can hear one another to keep time? And, how do you coordinate the onset of something? Who's going to lead off with the song, particularly as often it's unaccompanied, right? So, yeah.
Right, and there's lots of failures and lots of things that you try and don't work in that space. And I think that's a key part of it. It's unpredictable and it's adaptable. Who are you going to encounter? What are they going to sort of be able to do together with you? What's going to feel really embarrassing to do in that space? What's going to
really
feel
important? Yeah. Yeah. As somebody who's I've often tried to lead worship in unusual spaces, and I think the embarrassment factor of the people that you're working with is definitely an issue to be borne in mind. Is this something that people are going to feel able to do, or are they going to cringe at being asked to do this in this space?
Yeah. I'm going to keep rattling through the list of different kinds of chapters. I got 3 more. So my third chapter was looking at requiems and requiems for lost species, and what people are doing with those and what they're trying to do with those. And that's again a similar thing. A requiem is this sort of cultural Christian form that's become part of our wider culture. Everyone knows vaguely what a requiem is supposed to do. And you can sort of take the Christian elements and do something with them, or you can sort of take this general concept of a requiem and do something else with it. And so requiems become parts of protests, they become parts of concert performances, they become all sorts of different things. Often a requiem liturgy, again, takes you on a journey from one place to another. And one of the questions a lot of people sort of writing ecological requiems are asking, what kind of journey? We're going to expect that sorrow and grief are there somewhere. What kind of hope are we aiming for at the end? Are we aiming for hope at the end or not? And there's a lot of really interesting literature on how sorrow and grief or the inability to have sorrow and grief in connection to particular losses and deaths shows what we have a sense of kinship with. We grieve family. We grieve people we're close to. Are there certain kinds of lives that we don't grieve, that we don't see ourselves in solidarity with? And that sense of lament as a place of creating solidarity with that can then have political implications. And I think that's one of the really interesting things that comes up here. A requiem, I think traditional requiems we don't think of as very political. Then we got Benjamin Britten with his war requiem, and okay, that is a very political requiem. And now we've got a lot of concert masses, a lot of requiems that do sort of say, okay, actually, these Christian liturgies they form a really interesting basis for thinking about a lot of fundamental issues in the world and pushing people to experience a certain narrative, a certain journey that might be really interesting and helpful in some of these situations.
Yeah, and it's making me think as you're saying that as well, that the very fact that this is something that's been taken out of a mass, in essence, in certain movements in a traditional medieval mass. Also, I mean, I think there's a theological dimension to this that's really important, of uh, which I would want to try and capture with liturgies that involve lament, which would be that of actually connecting with God's own lament as well. It's kind of like, this isn't just humans. This is actually something we're joining God in, and finding a relevant, helpful way to be able to lament with God as well as simply lament, if you like.
Yeah. And just looking down at all these things appearing in the chat, there's so many interesting observations
Yeah.
and questions. And I mean, in answer to Catherine, would a requiem for lost species begin with poetry or with music? I think it's one of the great things about the idea of a requiem that you can do it in 100 different ways. And I came across sort of amateurs doing it with very few resources and a couple of readings and a sense of occasion. And I came across people that are commissioned composers to do something, or were really interested in producing a large scale work themselves. And so the idea can make itself, can sort of manifest itself in a lot of different ways. And I think that's really important in terms of our current situation. We don't want just things that people with a lot of resources can do. We want people with lots of resources to be able to do something, but we also want everyone else to be able to do stuff as well.
And it's not just the kind of thing between poetry and music. For example, I did well, it wasn't. We didn't call it a requiem, but a remembrance of lost species. I mean, for those who don't know, there's a day on, I think it's the 30th of November, if I remember correctly, that there's actually, Lost Species Day. And we actually had a video essay that one of our academics had produced that was relevant to the kind of theme, which we started off by showing that for about 10 minutes, and then picked up the rest of the liturgy once that was drawing to an end. In fact, we overlapped the thing. So there's more media that we could bring into this as well.
Yeah. Second to last chapter. I sort of stumbled across some Catholic song festivals online that they did for Laudato Si Day, or Laudato Si Week. And they had a lot of music. They gathered together musicians from all around the world that had written music in response to Laudato Si. And a lot of the music, to be perfectly honest, I didn't find all that exciting. I found the music quite bland, using quite trite words and sentiments a lot of the time. But then I started getting interested when I was thinking, okay, why are they doing this music? And they were doing the music. It was accompanying a whole range of different projects, and that was where I started to get interested. Okay, this isn't music that's on its own. It's music because you've got this community here that's engaging in this ecological project. You've got this other community here which is engaging in a certain kind of ecological protest. You've got this one over here that's trying to do some kind of reconciliation work. And the music is accompanying all these different things as part of a much bigger strategy and range of projects. And it was sort of this insight, okay, music, worship, liturgy, they're never these standalone things. They sort of accompany us in other work and as part of our communities. And if we end up with them standing alone and not accompanying anything, then in some ways they've completely failed in their task.
And that's kind of an important general point, I think, with liturgy in general as well, is that not letting the best become the enemy of the good or the good enough. Yeah, in a particular situation, something may be good enough to help a bunch of people to express something or to come together before God. And it may sound a bit ropey to somebody on the outside who doesn't know the context, but that's okay, providing it works for those folk together in their relationship corporately before God. Then that's the important question at the end of the day.
Yeah. And just to sort of bring the journey through the book to its conclusion, the last sort of chapter is on forest churches and what they're doing with music. And that was a really interesting question to me. I mean, do you do music outside? Does it make sense outside? And a lot of them say no. But then they're still engaging in different kinds of sonic practices. Sound is still there. And you're thinking, okay, what is sound? Sound is there as this medium for relationship. When I'm speaking, that's giving me a certain power over the space around me. It's sort of traveling into your ears. You're all listening to my thoughts rather than someone else's. And in those outdoor spaces, it was okay that relationship between who's producing sound, who's being attentive to sound, how my sound relates to the sound of other beings is being renegotiated. What's the level of my sound? Who am I being attentive to? And what kind of role is it playing in that broader ecosystem? I mean, there's a lot of other things to Forest Church too, all this attentiveness to times and seasons, or the sort of rhythm of the year, the openness to traditions beyond purely Christian traditions as well. But for me, that sort of sound as relationship with space, as relationship with other beings, was the really fascinating one there. And the sort of general lessons for me across this whole sort of set of different things was, okay, people are innovating. I like that. They're innovating in different ways. They're being creative. And there's a lot of grassroots creativity going on here. These aren't people that have been told from someone above, this is how you do it. It's people trying things out, often in very provisional ways, sort of not knowing whether they'll work. Often non-musicians saying, okay, I can't write music, but I'll adapt some lyrics. I'll do something that I can do that seems to mean something. A sense that each of these different ways of doing things has its own strengths and weaknesses. I mean, Forest Church and the evangelicals, perhaps they're sort of polar opposites, right? The evangelicals are being very pragmatic and saying, okay, we'll do this. The Forest Church perhaps saying, okay, we'll throw away all our traditional liturgies, we'll reinvent everything in this outdoor environment, and we'll sort of be idealist in a different way. And realizing that actually this whole range of things is really important. And one of the other things I came across was the fact that a lot of them, the people trying things out, aren't initially very aware of what other people are trying out. And I think that's got a lot better over the last few years. We're slowly sort of becoming aware of what different people are doing. But that sense of, okay, what I can offer is one part of the picture. And that sense of what the alternatives are, what these other things are, gives me almost permission to do my own little bit and say that, okay, that this bit's important, doesn't do everything, but it helps in this direction. There's lots of stuff about transcending boundaries too. I think one of the things I came across was environmental liturgies as something that push us to form relationships with people and spaces and beings that we wouldn't otherwise. Environment, ecology, it's a common human concern, a common concern beyond the human realm as well. It pushes us out of those kinds of spaces.
A number of the things coming up in the chat at the moment are about singing and outdoors and outdoor activity. I think the singing outdoors is probably worth thinking about a little bit more, perhaps. That I mean, one of the things that occurred to me with that is there are some spaces which I've used for worship in park spaces, actually in central Newcastle, in effect. And there is an issue there of now, if we're having singing, how likely is it that there are going to be passers-by? And is this going to be one of those occasions for embarrassment that you've got a bunch of weirdos singing strange stuff in this open space? Or is it, or will that feel okay? Will it be okay? And I guess, you know, the comment about carol singing being an outdoor activity in terms of its conception and wassailing and so on, all being, you know, envisaged being outdoors, but at least there's a recognised genre for being outdoors with those things. Whereas in some cases, the more traditional, usual Christian singing that might take place in a building may sometimes feel a bit weird out of doors. I don't know.
But I think that sense of weirdness is also really important. I think even if there's no one around me and I'm just singing in the middle of a forest and I know no one's going to hear me, there's still that sense of weirdness because
Yeah,
I'm interacting with birds, with trees, and does my song make sense in that context? So what
yeah.
kind of sound makes sense in that outdoor context? And reflecting on that is really important to us, whether or not we come up with some new musical practice. It changes the way we're thinking about our relationship with other beings.
Did you come across anybody who was consciously picking up things from, as it were, the general sonic landscape and turning that into song used in worship?
Um, Not necessarily the sonic landscape. So I think when I was talking to people about singing, they would say they sing more quietly in those outdoor spaces because they don't want to overpower other beings that are making sounds.
Mm.
Um, I came across people that would make observations about natural world around them and incorporate those into the songs, right? We've noticed this, so we're going to sing about this. Outside of Christian traditions, I have come across more of that interaction. There's a clarinetist by the name of David Rothenberg, who I find really fascinating because he goes outdoors with his clarinet and tries to play duets with nightingales or with whales and things, and a very direct interaction there. I think that's a practice he develops over a long time, and it's a really fascinating practice. I would find it really interesting to see what that meant if you tried to incorporate it within Christian liturgy and ritual, whether there's a way of doing that in a way that feels meaningfully Christian. Perhaps not clarinet duets, but that sense of interaction.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm noticing that time is moving on, and still really useful things coming out in terms of what people are putting into the chat. Thank you, everyone. I'm just wondering whether you and I, between us, in the last few minutes before we open up more generally, uh, have got some, as it were, top tips from in composing corporate worship for, particularly with the environment and climate in mind.
do you want to start? Do you have any top tips?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways I've already mentioned them, but it's probably worth just revisiting them as well. Kind of know who you're taking the journey with, really, and relates to that where you're doing it. So if you're going outside, do make sure you've walked through the possible activities beforehand. I've had the problem in the past of composing something for doing outdoors and relying on my own memory at some points about how the space was, and then we get there and it's not quite as I remembered, and that it has made a little bit of a difference. I had to adapt at the last minute in terms of how to lead that. So the shortcut was not my friend at that point. So I just warn folk, do walk it through beforehand if you've got particular activities.
Yeah. I think one of the things for me is,
And someone's put about accessibility as well, which also comes into that.
yeah, when I sort of look across so many different groups thinking very different ways, it's hard to say, okay, there's one sort of thing that they will have in common, one sort of way that, okay, this is what we recommend. I think for me, sort of being, yeah, similarly sensitive to communities, I think a lot of what you're doing is going to become meaningful in community and it's going to emerge out of relationships. And I think I'm a big fan of giving people permission to be creative, but I think I'm very against this idea of the sort of lone genius artist. I'm much more a fan of creativity as a response to community, as a response to context, as a response to the things around you. Um, I think I think a lot of this is trial and error. I think giving people permission to do trial and error and be a bit creative in low-key ways is really key. Um, but also that just being aware that there are other people doing this. There's other people trying out things, and we can learn from them. We can look at what they're doing. We can observe them, and we can say, okay, I'm going to take a bit of what you're doing over there, and I think that makes sense within what we're doing over here. Um, and I'm going to do something a bit different with it.
Yeah.
Um, but I think ecological crisis, I think it requires innovation. I
Yeah.
think it requires a little bit of courage to do things a little bit differently. And that courage often does emerge in community, in relationship, in observing where other people have tried something, and you might be able to piggyback on their efforts.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that reminds me as well. I think that if you've got a longer project in mind, the idea of introducing more ecologically kind of sensitive stuff into your regular church worship is actually to have people, 2 or 3 or more people that you're constantly appraising things with, coming up with ideas, trying them out even amongst yourselves before seeking permission or the means to kind of share them more widely. So when you do share them more widely, actually you've got the best chance of people really being able to get hold of it, because it's actually been road tested or beta tested on before you make the big break into a big audience. I was going to say congregational setting.
And I think a lot of I suppose some of us are sort of bruised by having tried things in the past and them being rejected.
Yeah.
But with some of these things, there's surprise in the opposite direction, that people tried something, they didn't think it would really mean anything, but actually their community around them found
Yeah.
it really helpful or took it on in a
Yeah.
way they hadn't
Yeah.
expected. So I think those trials and those surprises can happen in lots of different directions.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a matter of scaffolding, really, and how you introduce it. People might have an expectation, oh, this could be different and awkward, and then actually discover it's really good. But sometimes it can be the way that you've introduced things that helps give people the feeling that it's okay to try it, and quite often then for them to discover that actually it really does work, it really does resonate.
I talked to one person who her children had written a little song about some of the nature around them. And I think because the community they were part of really appreciated the children, they were really open to it when they sort of brought this thing about all the creatures and things around them into the worship. And there were various other things that ended sort of coming out of that goodwill, that the community started um, supporting local wildlife charities or things. And I think that sense of being able to operate out of people's love for you and openness to
Yeah,
you.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's where what you said at the beginning about, very often if you ask someone what is liturgy, a phrase like the work of the people, which is a kind of almost literal translation of the thing, but actually that's where that you begin to realize that's true. It's a community of people working together to do something together before God, and in a particular context, that really is work, and it's of the people. That actually is what it says on the tin at that level.
yeah, we've got a lot of pragmatic things coming up in the chat, which
Yeah.
I think is very helpful.
Yes, I'm keeping an eye on the time, and actually, one of the we probably ought to be opening up, I think, to questions from the whole group at this point, and sort of coming to an end of us being, the more focused chat folk, and allowing other people to come on in, I think. But if you've not, I'd say to everyone more generally, if you've not already had a look at the chat, have another look at that, and maybe if anyone wants to ask somebody who's put something in the chat a bit more about it, maybe that might be a way to start, and we'll just see where the conversation goes for the next 10 minutes or so. Does that seem all right?
It's good. I'll take the spotlight off both of you, and then we can see everybody in the room.
And just while people are looking at that, I'm just putting something into the chat of that. If you haven't already come across it, folk, you might want to check it out. It's something that the Borrowed Time Project in Green Christian has been working on. So there's a bunch of resources there if you haven't already come across them. Someone else put something in earlier as well with a link.
So if anybody wants to come in with a question or a comment or pick up on something in the chat, pop up your hand, or either virtually or
even share some good practice. Something
Absolutely.
that worked well.
I just come in with one thing of having on protest marches, the climate going back for 2 decades, no, 2.5 decades. It's very it's encouraging, it's reaffirming, be with a bunch of people and all be singing, and other people will join in. And as long as it's something that people can easily pick up on, it really does a great boost to the whole thing. And one little story, those of you who might have been on the big one service at St. John's, and we walked to the Shell building as usual, and they refused to take in the letter from the Archbishop of York. And so we marched away. And as we marched away, the Salvation Army band who'd been playing in the church struck up a song I didn't know, but someone who is a Salvationist said to me, "You know what they're playing?" And I haven't got the exact words, but it's something in the lines of, "The walls of evil, pull them down, pull them down." This was a traditional Salvation Army song being used in a convention, in a current situation, and to great effect. So music itself can be the message, in other words.
Yeah.
Sandra?
No, Sandra's got a hand up. So.
Yes, there's a role for dance and with protest challenge as well. I took part in some of the Preston New Road No Faith in Fracking protests, and they were basically held on a busy road in the cycle lane. But we did an elm circle dance, and which goes out and in. So it floored the guards who were supposed to be keeping an eye on us, because just as they thought they ought to arrest us because we were taking up the space, we all went back again. So it was and actually circle dancing, I think, is I like liturgical dance. The other thing we did was scatter leaves, which blurred the boundaries, and it was interesting because they were all really peaceful things in themselves, but they were challenges too. And people, as they scattered a few leaves over the red lines or yellow lines or whatever, just said something on their heart very briefly. So I think dance does have a role.
And indeed, from what you've just said, other kinds of symbolic movements, and indeed drawing on things that are in the environment that you're that you're in at that point.
Yeah. I think Neil unmuted himself briefly earlier. I don't know whether he was gonna.
I was just going to say, from many years of doing Forest Church, it was always really important that we finish with food and shared food, and I think that was always a really good way of encouraging people to bring something to share, and that moment to sort of just connect with people more than just turning up and doing something and then going again. So
I thank you for that, Neil, as well, because I'm doing quite a lot of thinking about meals together, because what we've done, of course, in the last 1500 years of church tradition is tended to make the food thing into a little piece of bread and a little sip of wine. But it's quite clear when you look at the New Testament and actually other documents from the early church that eating together more fully was a big part of what Christian communities did. And I think recovering this eating together thing is probably something we ought to be exploring much more, and seeing eating itself as a wholesome, drawing together kind of ritual, which may or may not be explicitly Eucharistic in terms that we've now come to understand.
I think also a lot of these sort of liturgies and rituals, they do expand our canvas. The protest ones, sort of these interactions with the broader public, the forest church, to all these sort of other spaces and things around us and other materials. And I think a lot of this is about pushing outwards and saying, okay, we're thinking about the whole world, we're thinking about our whole society, and actually we need our liturgies and rituals to open out onto all these other things and not close us in on ourselves. And eating and drinking can be one of those things. It's sort of opening out onto that material dimension.
Yeah, definitely.
Judith was also going to say something, I think.
It just went through my mind a few years ago. We did some prayer walks during Advent, and we did them towards the end of the day. So you started in the light, but finished walking in the dark in our local park. And when you're walking in the dark, when you gradually go from light to dark, your eyes are fine walking, but just seemed a way of using the environment to reflect the kind of liturgical season.
Yeah.
So darkness.
Yeah. Heather as well has raised a hand. There we go.
Yes, I put something in the chat, but it's also connected to what Judith said. Is we do a small sort of monthly outdoor gathering thing, and I found really helpful, even before we started doing that, to connect to the Celtic wheel of the year, and to really kind of theme our. I mean, we take turns leading, so not everyone does this, but but to kind of theme our gathering around that season and around that festival, whatever it might be. So, we just had Samhain, and, talking a lot about sort of death and loss and letting go. And that's very much what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere, at this moment in time. And there's just a kind of, like you were talking earlier about responding to the soundscape, there's a kind of resonance there. It feels sort of right. I mean, it's not about right and wrong, but there's a kind of, I'm connecting to earth and to what is happening, at least, and in the space around me at this moment in time. There's just a kind of a bit of a synergy and connection there that I've experienced. So
yeah. And that's definitely something I think the Forest Church movement as a whole has sort of become increasingly conscious of and have tried to incorporate in different ways. I think it's something really important. And also those sort of resonances between those times and seasons and Christian times and seasons, and how does that sense of time and space coincide or not coincide?
And it's probably worth us revisiting the way that Christianity, as it moved into more northern Europe, particularly from East Mediterranean, kind of interacted with seasonal stuff, and kind of learn the lessons about how incorporating different traditions and different climates in worship. There's something to be learned from actually going back and seeing what happened.
Yeah.
Someone's Neil's put something in the chat that kind of relates to that by looks of it as well.
And since there's all sorts of books appearing in the chat, I'm going to use that chance
Yeah.
to advertise my book in the chat too. I'm afraid mine's probably more expensive than the others. I do apologize for that. It's probably in the
It has a
library.
discount. It has a discount code, I note.
It does.
Yes.
Um,
Excellent. Ruth has joined us on this. Ruth, I think we should send the chat round to everybody who registered. There have been so many wonderful ideas in the chat. And also, Mark, I think it was Mark earlier, or was it one of them was talking about playing music with wild creatures. I remember back in lockdown, you playing your viola with a bird outside the house. What bird were you playing with?
Yes, I played the swan on my viola with the pianist in her house, and I was by the window of her house in the garden, and her house backs onto this beautiful copse with lots of birds singing, robin and blackbird, and yeah, and it was all caught on the recording. It was very, very lovely.
Your voice was very faint, but I think we heard that.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, could you not hear me?
I heard.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
I just remembered as well, just breaking the thread slightly there. I'd mentioned earlier about a daily office where I've tried to incorporate environmental things just as a matter of course rather than as a special prayer kind of thing. And I've just put the link into the chat as well there. So that's there too.
And could you just say a word about the borrowed time, a little bit more about the borrowed time resources?
Yeah, I mean, we're actually consciously there with the Borrowed Time project, trying to curate in that part of the site resources that may help people to particularly focus on lament at the moment, but actually I'd like us to try and move beyond that. So if anyone's got something you think would be good to share in terms of helping people to do worship together with an environmental concern, it doesn't have to be a whole service. It can be just as you'll see from a lot of those things, it's simple actions that people could do together and adapt. Then yeah, I'm the curator for that bit of things. So I'd be very happy to receive ideas and incorporate them in due course into the I hope growing collection of ideas.
Robin.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
When you try and incorporate lament into eco worship or whatever it's called, how do you find it works best? I mean, is it best if the whole event or service is built around that, or is it something that you can fit into an appropriate place? How does it work most naturally, do you find? Does that
I'd
make
be
sense?
interested to hear what people say about this. I've seen both in terms of a service of lament, where that's been the chief kind of thing, and various ways of expressing that, from kind of liturgy, song, activities, prayer stations and so on, with the kinds of things that are on the website we've just been mentioning, to and it being just part of a liturgy where there are other things happening as well, like praise, like intercession, like confession. And do make some distinction between lament and confession. They can be closely allied, but they're not the same thing.
So, if it was so again, I'm asking, if supposing you wanted to integrate it into a service that had intercessions and confessions and so on, do you think there's a way it would most naturally fit into a flow rather than sticking out like a sore thumb and being quite jarring? Do you see what I mean?
Like,
I think the closeness of lament to confession for a lot of people is probably a clue. So it could actually be you're lamenting something that's that you're seeing as wrong, moving into recognizing our own implication in the wronging, as it were. That could be a natural flow, but also lament as part of intercessory prayer seems fairly natural for a lot of people. There are probably others as well, but for me, those are the things that first come to mind. But there may be other thoughts as well. I don't know whether Judith, with a hand up there, you wanted to come in on that.
in which case I'll come in briefly on that. And one of the things I sort of notice with a lot of the work on the contemporary worship music side of things is that question of flow is a really interesting one. If you've got a worship service that has a very unitary logic that's meant to accomplish one thing, then it is very hard to fit in something that sticks out, that does something different. Whereas if you've got a worship service that is already made up of different moments with different tasks that then fade from one thing into another, then it's much easier to fit something else in as one part of that broader sort of diversity and collage, I think.
Yeah, indeed.
Nice.
I think both Judiths have got hands up.
Judith first. She's before me.
This is just completely random. I think in the Methodist Church they have a covenant service at the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether could the covenant service be something that makes a covenant between the people and creation for the year, and sort of make a sort of a green aspect to that. Anyway, just a thought.
There is a really nice sentence saying we're sorry for how we've treated the earth, which I really like, because that is a green sentence in the Methodist Church that you can use.
Yeah, I'm noticing the time, and I'm thinking we
mentioned on Green Christian's website. So for the millennium, we had a Settle Methodist Church. We have a hymn competition every year, and they had to care for the environment. They collected the best hymns, and I put them up. A lot of them were on the theme of we've got a beautiful world, we've spoiled it. Please help God, please help us make it better. Yeah. Lots of different things on that, and a lot of them had one good verse, but they weren't sort of all good verses. They're still there. It's on the websites, and people do use them. And often the tune that's popular. So the two hymns that were for all the saints, they've been, when I can see which people have requested or have wanted to use. A lot of people seem to like those two hymns just because of the music. That's just an observation. And if you've got
thank you.
And if you've got something you want me to put onto it, then let me know.
Thanks, Judith. Good to remember that as well and be reminded. Barbara, though, do you want to pull us together?
Sadly, yes, we will have to pull it to a close. We will keep the link open, though, for a while after we officially close the meeting. But I'd like to ask Mark to just end this super session with a prayer. Over to you, Mark.
My way of praying is going to be different from Andi's. There was a prayer on a Greek Orthodox website that I sort of stumbled across this week, and I wanted to use some of that. O Lord, how lovely it is to be your guest. Breeze full of scent, mountains reaching to the skies, waters like a boundless mirror, reflecting the sun's golden rays and the scudding clouds. All nature murmurs mysteriously, breathing depths of tenderness. Birds and beasts bear the imprint of your love. Blessed are you, Mother Earth, in your fleeting loveliness, which wakens our yearning for happiness that will last forever in the land where amid beauty that grows not old, rings out the cry, Alleluia. You brought me into this life as into an enchanted paradise. We have seen the sky like a deep blue cup ringing with birds in the azure heights. We have listened to the soothing murmur of the forest and the sweet-sounding music of the waters. We have tasted fragrant fruit of fine flavor and sweet-scented honey. How pleasant is our stay with you on earth. 'Tis a joy to be your guest. Glory to you for the feast of life. Glory to you for the perfume of lilies and roses. Glory to you for each different taste of berry and fruit. Glory to you for the sparkling silver of early morning dew. Glory to you for each smiling, peaceful awakening. Glory to you for eternal life in us, a messenger of heaven. Glory to you, O God, from age to age. Amen.
Thank you so much, Mark, for ending our session with such a beautiful prayer. I'm very grateful to you, and grateful to both you, Mark and Andii. I think we'd all agree it's been a really fascinating and instructive and informative, inspiring conversation between the two of you.